Please turn to Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8. Again, you're going to need to really work to stay with me this morning here. I'm happy with what I come up with to try to explain this, but it's again not the easiest stuff in the world. I'm going to try to engage you in some of the slides that I've used already to help as we go through this, and just hang in there. You got to stick with me closely here. Let's start out first two verses, Daniel chapter 8. It says, "In the third year of King Belshazzar's reign," remember who King Belshazzar was, "I, Daniel, had a vision, and after the one that had already appeared to me." That was the one we looked at last week in chapter 7. "In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. And then in the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal." So now, first of all, real quickly, here at this point in the book of Daniel, the language changes from Aramaic back to Hebrew. For the rest, the original language that this was written in, it was written in Aramaic for a while there. It started out at the beginning of the book in Hebrew, changed to Aramaic for a number of chapters, and now the original language switched back to Hebrew. The vision Daniel described here in chapter 8 happened 2 years, he said, after the vision that we looked at last week that he described in chapter 7. But now remember, the handwriting on the wall, the end of King Belshazzar's life, and the end of the Babylonian Empire, we looked at all that back in chapter 5. And so, if this vision occurred in, what's it say? The third year of King Belshazzar's reign, what does that, chronologically, when did this vision happen?
Before the writing.
It happened prior to what was described back in chapter 5. It's another example of the Bible is not always chronological, certainly not always in the terms of the books like themselves in comparison with each other, but even within a given book. The Bible is often, Hebrew thought, Middle Eastern thought in general was often more topical than chronological. And so this is going back now. Daniel reported things like that at the end of his life, when the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon. Belshazzar was killed that night and so forth, after the handwriting on the wall and everything. Daniel told that whole story, and Daniel was like 85 years old at that point. He was at the end of his life. Now he's going back, and he's sharing some visions that he had actually before Belshazzar was killed and the Medo-Persians took over and so forth. And so that's something very important to understand here. God revealed information to Daniel about 4 kingdoms, remember last week in chapter 7. Four kingdoms and 4 what? What do we...
Beasts.
Yeah, four different kinds of beasts last week. And remember, they correspond to different portions of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about that we looked at way back, seems like a long time ago, back in chapter 2. And so Daniel talked about those 4 beasts last week, and now here in chapter 7, now here in chapter 8, we're looking at what he revealed that was, and of course God had revealed it to him, more specific information relative to the second and third kingdoms, relative to this second kingdom here and the third kingdom here. And now we had the statue, we had the beast here, and now in Daniel chapter 8 we have 2 more animals. A ram representing again this Medo-Persian empire, and a goat representing the Greek empire. So again, we've looked at before that the second kingdom, all the statue, the parts of the statue, and the beasts, and now today the ram represent the Medo-Persian Empire, and then the goat and what we looked at in previous weeks as well represent the Greek empires. In the vision that Daniel saw, he saw himself like standing in the citadel in Susa. The citadel was a fortress and also a palace for the Persian government. Susa was about 200 to 250 miles east of Babylon in what is today the nation of Iran. just to give you an idea as far as worldview and so forth. Now, a century after Daniel wrote this account, the Persian king Xerxes built a magnificent palace in Susa, which was where the events recorded in the biblical book of Esther eventually happened. And the prophet Nehemiah from the Bible was King Artaxerxes' cupbearer. That also happened in the citadel in Susa. And so in this vision, Daniel's actually seeing a place that was future in this vision that God gave him. And remember, it was in the future, not only in regard to the Medo-Persian Empire, which was the one that was going to conquer Babylon in a few years, but also relative to the kingdom that was eventually going to conquer the Medo-Persians. And so all this stuff was all in the future that Daniel was given this vision about. Let's go to verses 3 and 4. He says, I looked up, and there before me was a what? A ram with two horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. And one of the horns was longer, though, than the other. But it what? Grew up later. I'll talk about that in a little while. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south, and no animal could stand against it. And none could rescue from its power, and it did as it pleased, and it became great. And so in his vision, Daniel saw this ram, and we'll read later on in verse 20 that this ram with the two horns represented the kingdom and the kings of the combined Medo-Persian Empire. And one of the ram's horns was what? Longer than the other. But that longer horn had grown up later than the shorter horn. The longer horn symbolized the same thing that the bear in Daniel's first vision. The bear was what? It was raised up on one side. And so this longer horn represents the same thing that the bear did that was raised up on one side, indicating that this alliance of the kingdom between the Medes and the Persians, that the Persians were actually stronger. The longer horn would represent the Persians, and the shorter horn would represent the Medes. And the longer horn symbolizing again that the Persians was the weaker, or was the stronger kingdom. Doing as it wished, this ram, which represented again the Medo-Persian kingdom that would eventually come, it didn't happen yet. Babylon is still in charge. Belshazzar is still alive when Daniel's having these visions. But when this stuff would happen, that this vision was depicting, this Medo-Persian kingdom attacked to the west and the north and the south, doing basically what it wanted to do, and nobody could stop it. It dominated every kingdom it moved against, and it became a great kingdom in Daniel's vision. We now know from history that Medo-Persia eventually defeated Babylon and also other countries to the west. Now, Daniel, if you could go to the next, back up to the maps quickly. There's the obelisk. On back, another map. Okay, let's go back another map yet. Okay, and so one more. And so I don't know if I'm standing in somebody's way here or not, but again, here you have the Medo-Persian Empire. Go back one more and see if it's a better view, Daniel. Yeah, see, here's Babylon, here's Persia, and it said that the ram attacked to the what direction? To the west. Persia's over here. You see where Babylonia is over to the west of them. And so he attacked to the west. And then he also attacked to the north and the south. And that ties into, I just wanted to show at least that one detail on the map there. He attacked to Babylon and other countries to the west of him. This would be to the west in this direction. Babylon was there. He attacked to the north, Armenia and Scythia. This is all from history, from non-biblical history. We'll tell you this. You can look it up. And then to the south, he attacked Egypt and Ethiopia. And so once again, we see that history has literally fulfilled biblical prophecy. Daniel wrote about this stuff way before it ever happened But when it eventually happened, I'm trying to show you on the map, like the ram attacking to the west and the north and the south, history will tell you these countries I mentioned, that's who the Medo-Persian Empire attacked. So now go to verses 5 through 8. I have to keep moving here. I got a lot. As I was thinking about this, Daniel said, suddenly what? A goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in a great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. And the ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it. And none could rescue the ram from its power, from the power of the goat. The goat became very great. But at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. And in its place, what? Four prominent horns grew up toward the four winds of the heavens. So Daniel's thinking about the ram. He's trying to comprehend the ram with the two different horns and all that stuff. But then all of a sudden he sees what coming? A goat with a very impressive horn between its two eyes, coming from what direction? The west. Again, over here's Greece. Again, the ram is over in this area and built their kingdom and so forth. And then here an attack came from the west. Persia attacked Babylon to the west. Then now the goat's coming. This is predicting another kingdom coming. Okay. This goat attacked from the west, and so attacked the Persian kingdom, the Medo-Persian kingdom from the west. We read in verse 21 that this shaggy goat represented the Greek Empire. And the fact that it was so fast that its feet didn't even touch the ground, we'll talk about what that symbolizes here in a little bit. And so this Greek Empire, and who was the prominent horn, the one horn between its eyes? Who did that represent? Alexander the Great, who basically founded this powerful nation. Now we can easily see again on the map that Greece and the original Macedonian kingdom, like I showed you, was directly west of the Medo-Persian Empire. So when the Greeks attacked the Medo-Persian Empire, that fulfilled Daniel's prophecy here. He said that this goat would attack from the west, and that was fulfilled when the Greek kingdom under Alexander the Great attacked Medo-Persia from the west. And again, perfect fulfillment of the Bible and what was prophesied way before it ever happened. At this time, the Greek kingdom wasn't even formed yet when Daniel was getting this prophecy. What the goat represented, that the Greek nation hadn't even been formed yet, as it was whenever Alexander the Great ended up attacking the Medo-Persian kingdom. And so this Greek army led by Alexander the Great became known for its speed. And that fulfilled the symbol of the speedy goat, as well as back last week, to remember what beast represented the Greek kingdom? The leopard, and it had what on its back? 4 wings. And so a leopard's fast, plus 4 wings made it even faster. And so that both of those represent this Greek nation. Both of those visions, the visions that we talked about last week in chapter 7, and now this week, the shaggy goat, both of them represent the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great developed a different style of warfare that he used with great success. Again, you can study history about this. He used infantry tied really closely together with shields and spears, and they formed a knife-like force called, does anybody know what it's called? A phalanx. Yes, a knife-like force called a phalanx. This military, it was a way of making military attacks, and that type of warfare was copied and was still being used 1,500 years later after Alexander came up with it. 1,500 years later by the Byzantine armies of Constantinople were still using the phalanx formation, military formation. It was not uncommon in the victories of Alexander for him to defeat forces 10 times greater than his. 10 times greater that they would defeat. And so the ram was powerless to defend himself. The goat defeated the ram, and the ram's former greatness now was possessed by who? The goat, or the Greek kingdom, who the goat represents. Previously, nobody could escape the ram's power. Now nobody could escape the goat's power. This account in Daniel is saying what Daniel saw in the vision. When the goat was its most powerful, its single prominent horn, what happened to it? It got broken off. And what did that symbolize? Alexander's death. Alexander the Great's death. And what grew up in place of the one horn? Four other horns. And what does that parallel from the vision last week with the leopard?
Got split up into four.
How many heads did the leopard have? If you didn't remember, you should be able to put the pieces together. Yeah, the leopard had 4 heads. The goat has 4 horns that came up and replaced the one. And both of them, the 4, that represents the 4 kingdoms that the Greek kingdom got divided up into eventually. And scroll ahead there, Daniel. Next screen. Next, let's see. Next one. There you go. I showed you this back when I did my introduction, when we first started this book at the beginning of January. Here, remember the Ptolemaic kingdom, the Antigonid, the Seleucids, and then other Greek states. There were 4 divisions. All this was the Greek Empire. After Alexander died, there was a bunch of bickering and fighting, and I'll talk about that quickly, but then it ended up being divided into 4 parts. And this Seleucia was the center of the Seleucid kingdom, and that's from where there's going to be a particular person that we really need to pay attention to came from this. But again, I showed you this map clear back in my introduction, and now we're getting to the part here in Daniel where it's talking about where this stuff happened. Daniel prophesied this with the leopard and the 4 heads and the goat and the 4 horns. It was all predicting what would happen to this Greek Empire eventually. And again, what? It happened. The prophecy was fulfilled again. Again, when Daniel wrote this, Babylon was still in power, and Greek wasn't even an organized, the Greece Empire wasn't even organized yet. It was still a bunch of separate city-states and stuff like that. Verses 9 through 12, listen, you got to track. You got to really stay with me. You got to track harder. I'm telling you, now we're getting in, the waters are getting deep. Pull up the hip waders. We're really deep water here. Verses 9 through 12. 9 through 12. Out of one of them came another horn. Out of one of what? Out of the 4 horns of the goat came another horn, which what? Started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them, and it set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. And because of the rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Now, you got to really stay with me here. Out of the 4 horns came another horn, right? Out of one of them. Out of one of the horns. Out of one of the horns, and which horn did I tell you already did this horn that started small and grew come from? The Seleucid kingdom here. All right? Out of that kingdom, that's this horn that arose out of one of the 4. This is the one of the 4. And the horn arose out of that kingdom. So it was representative of a leader who arose out of that historical kingdom. And which beast of Daniel chapter 7, again, represents the same kingdom as the goat? Just to review. The third beast, right? This is important. It was the leopard, and it was the third beast. Keep that in mind, because it's very important. The third beast of Daniel chapter 7. The third beast was the leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. The third beast of Daniel chapter 7 and the goat of Daniel chapter 8, as well as the belly and thighs of bronze from chapter 2, they all represent which empire?
Greece.
The Greek Empire. Greece. The Greek Empire, yes. And think back last week, where did the little horn of Daniel chapter 7 from last week, where did he come from? When he saw the little horn growing, it grew up in the midst of what? 10 horns, right? 10 horns that were on what? Which beast? The 4th beast. Here's what I'm driving at, folks, if you haven't connected the dots yet. It's not the same. This horn that started small and grew is not the little horn of chapter 7. It's one, though, that pictured. He's a type. He's an example of what that little horn that we looked at last week would be like. But they are on two different beasts. The little horn was on the fourth beast that we looked at last week in chapter 7. This horn that started small and grew is on the third beast in the Greek kingdom, not from the fourth beast, right? And so they can't be the same. Yet guess what? Many people in churches believe that they're the same. That this small horn that grew is the same as the little horn that we looked at last week. Because they want to, in their theology, they project that there's not going to be this eventual time of the tribulation on, with the ruler, with the Messiah's kingdom supplanting the kingdom of the Antichrist and all that kind of stuff. But I hope you can see from the way I explained it, there is no way. They're on completely separate, different beasts. The imagery is two separate beasts, the third beast and the fourth beast. This one we're looking at here right now is on the third beast. Last week's little horn was on the fourth. They can't be the same person. Daniel's vision in chapter 8 predicted the rise of a ruler in which empire? We're looking at here in chapter 8. A ruler in the Greek Empire, who would dominate the people in the land of Israel, desecrate the Jewish temple, disrupt Israel's worship of God, and demand for himself the authority and worship that belongs only to God. Although they are not writings that are inspired by God, something called the apocryphal writings, which include the books of 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees, describe some of the details of what this evil ruler did and how things turned out. So Daniel's prophecy was then fulfilled nearly 400 years later, when this stuff about the small horn who grew all ended up coming to fruition. Almost 400 years later. This evil ruler in the Greek Empire was a type or an example of the little horn from chapter 7 that we looked at last week. But that little horn has still not appeared, right? He won't appear until when? The tribulation period, which still hasn't happened. And so, but this one we're looking at today, this small horn that grew in the Greek Empire, was an example of how this future little horn would be in the tribulation, except he'll be far worse. Far worse. And he's the one that we most commonly call what? Antichrist. You okay so far? You tracking with this? So the small horn that grew in Daniel's vision here in chapter 8 exerted power, it said, to the south and to the east and toward what land? The beautiful land. What's the beautiful land referring to? Israel. Referring to Israel, the land of Israel. Historical records show that this was fulfilled. This extending of the power to the southeast and toward the beautiful land was fulfilled when this Greek ruler attacked Egypt to the south of his base, which was in Syria. He attacked Persia, Parthia, and Armenia to his east. And then, of course, he attacked the beautiful land, which we've said is Israel. And world history will back all that up, that ended up happening. He became a great persecutor of the people of Israel. They're called the hosts of heaven in verse 10. That we read there. He killed tens of thousands of Jews. He sold a whole bunch more into slavery. He set himself up as Israel's king. He called himself the Prince of the Host. And I will tell you, there is a lot more complicated explanations of these verses here that I've read that I'm commenting on, but we're not going to get into it. It's too much. And it's too much for this sermon and so forth. But there is a lot more information out there if you want to understand these verses that we're looking at right now better. It's too much to get into right here. Verse 12 tells us that once again, God would eventually deliver his people, give his people over into the hands of another wicked king. And another wicked kingdom. And it would be because of their what? Their disobedience, and the word that's used in verse 12 there, their rebellion. The rebellion against who? Against God. And so remember, this has been the theme. Why did God allow Assyria to attack and decimate the northern part of the kingdom of Israel? Because they were rebelling against God, and it was an act of judgment, and they were disobeying and so forth. God then used Babylonia to attack and decimate and exile the southern kingdom of Israel for the same reasons. And now here we are, where God is using another nation and an evil ruler and an evil empire to bring punishment and judgment upon Israel. Notice in verse 12 that a small horn that grew threw truth to the ground, it says. Evil, powerful pagan rulers always try to trample the truth of God. Always try to trample the truth of God under their feet. But eventually, guess what happens? Eventually, God always brings them down. Always. And He always will. Verses 13 and 14. Hang on to what we went through there. Verses 13 and 14. Then Daniel said, I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the rebellion that causes this desolation and the surrender of the sanctuary and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. And he said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. So Daniel heard two supernatural beings talking to each other in this vision. These holy ones were almost certainly what? Angels who had roles in the revelation of God to Daniel. They played a role in that. And one angel asked another one, how long would it be? For what we had just looked at in the previous verses, how long would all that take?
2,300 evenings.
2,300 evenings and mornings. I'll get to the meaning of that in a little bit here. Just not just yet. But God's purpose, again, eventually would be to restore the kingdom after a time under this little horn that would grow, or this horn that started out small and that will grow. So go to verses 15 through 19. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Eli calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. And as he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns what? The time of the end. Listen closely. While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. And then he touched me and raised me to my feet. Excuse me. He said, I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns what? The appointed time of the end. So once again, Daniel's struggling here. He's struggling to try to, understand, and he hears these angels are talking, and an angel is named. What's the angel's name? Gabriel. And certainly we got to imagine that God sent Gabriel to Daniel to give him some explanations. But the man's voice, it says, who commanded Gabriel to tell Daniel the meaning of the vision, was that the voice of God? Well, many think it was. Some think it was specifically the voice of the pre-incarnate Christ. Some people think that it was the archangel Michael, who was the other voice telling Gabriel, tell him what the deal is here. What do I normally do in these deals? Many of you could say.
No.
Does it say whose voice it was? No. It just says a voice came from the Eli, from the canal. We don't know. People make these guesses as to who it was. Could it be any of those guesses? I guess it could be, but I say the text doesn't say it, so why guess? We don't know. Either God spoke directly or God assigned an angel to tell Daniel. It's probably one of those two things, but we have no way of knowing. The name of the angel Gabriel appears here. Later on in chapter 9, verse 21, it'll appear. And his name appears one other place in Scripture, and where's that? Christmas time. Think Christmas. The angel came to Mary and told her what was going to be going on. That's the third mention of the name Gabriel, of this angel Gabriel. Gabriel's words about the need to understand the vision concerns the time of the end. As stated in verse 17, and in verse 19 it says the time of wrath concerning the appointed time of the end. That's critical. Those references are critical to understand what all is being talked about here. Are we still just talking about the small horn that grew and it was coming out of the Greek Empire, or is there something more going on here? The first point of reference in these verses is clearly the time of the reign of the horn that started out small and grew, described here in chapter 8, the evil ruler who would come out of one of the four horns of the goat and persecute the Jews and do all this stuff. And we'll talk about him in a little bit, but again, here, listen. Another point that you got to make sure you get out of this. We must understand that here in chapter 8, there's clearly a secondary reference in a number of verses here in chapter 8 to the yet future time of great persecution and judgment of the Jews during what we call what? The tribulation, and especially the second 3.5 years, the second half of that tribulation, when the little horn from last week, from Daniel chapter 7, when that horn that will arise from the 10 horns on the fourth beast, the Antichrist, when he will do similar things as this horn here that rose out of the Greek Empire, except he will do far worse than that guy ever did. The phrase, listen to me, the phrase, the time of the end, used here in chapter 8 that we just read, that we looked at in verse 19, is also used later in chapter 12, where there in chapter 12, there is no question that it refers to the time right before the second coming of Christ. It's clear in chapter 12 that it's not talking about back in the Greek Empire, stuff that's already happened long ago for us, BC time. It's clearly in chapter 12 talking about the time of the tribulation period that still hasn't happened yet. And so that same phrase is used in chapter 12 and clearly in reference to the tribulation. That's one of the big evidences that where it's used here in chapter 8, something more is going on than just the description of the small horn that grew big in the Greek kingdom. Something that's already happened. That's in view, but also in view is somebody like him, except who will be far worse. And again, that's the Antichrist. Again, this is why I and others believe what we believe about the book of Daniel and about the kingdoms that are coming and the Antichrist and his kingdom and all this stuff. If you look at what Daniel 8 here, and I've done the best I can to explain it to you, to why the little horn of last week, chapter 7, is not the same small horn that grew out of the Greek kingdom. They're two different ones. And that blows out of the water the theory that, again, all this stuff has already happened. Many people say all this stuff has already happened. The fact of, again, this verse that's mentioned here in chapter 8 is also mentioned in chapter 12. The descriptions that are coming up in verses 23 through 25 here in chapter 8, which can be seen to describe both the small horn that grew as well as the little horn of last week in chapter 7, all of that helps us to see that although the descriptions here in Daniel chapter 8 were literally fulfilled, literally and historically fulfilled in events involving the Jews and their temple and an evil Greek ruler in the period around 170 BC to 164 BC, those same events that actually have already happened, those same events and that same evil ruler from back then foreshadow and symbolize Antichrist, the future world ruler who will dominate the affairs at the end of the times of the Gentiles, especially in the second half of the tribulation period. We will start to see this in the very next chapter, chapter 9. You can praise God now. I'm not going to chapter 9 today. But the next time we're into this, we will see this starting, this reference to this future leader as well as this one that would rise out of the Greek Empire that's already happened. This is called typology. Again, this word a type. And just a couple of real quick examples of typology. You know the story of when God told Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, right? And just to test his faith, he was never going to let him do it. And when he got there and Abraham was ready to do it, God stopped him, and God did what? He provided a ram to be sacrificed, a substitutionary sacrifice. And Abraham had said earlier, God will provide the lamb, remember? And God did. And that happened. All that stuff happened. But what was it a type of? What was it a picture of?
Jesus.
Whenever Jesus would be provided as a substitutionary sacrifice for who? For any of us who have come to Him in true saving faith. It's what we remember tonight at communion. We celebrate and remember he was the substitutionary sacrifice. But all that stuff with Abraham and Isaac, that all happened. It was real, it happened, it's already done, but it was a picture, it was a type of something even greater that was going to happen. The other example of typology is, again, in Isaiah chapter 7 and 8. It was prophesied that a child would be born that would be a sign of salvation to the people of Judah, right? What most people don't get is there was an actual child born at that time. But there's also, it was a type. He was an example of a much greater child that would be born one day who would also bring salvation to people, but to all people who would come to him. It was the child that was born in Isaiah's day was what? A type of whom?
Jesus.
Picture of whom? A picture of the baby Jesus who would be born, who would be a sign of salvation to all who would come to him. That's what typology is. The child was born in Isaiah's day. Now all that stuff happened, it was real, but it was a picture of something even greater that was yet to happen, and then it happened when Jesus came incarnate, when Jesus was born. Got to move on. Verses 20 through 22. 20 through 22. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The four horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. So I already gave you this information earlier, just to help understanding as we were going through this. But this is where Gabriel actually told Daniel who these animals represented, who they would turn out to be eventually. The same kings and kingdoms represented again by the bear raised up on one side in chapter 7, and as well as the leopard with the wings, for both Medo-Persia and for the Greek kingdom. The large single horn between the eyes of the goat again represented who? Alexander the Great. Founded the Greek Empire, came from the west with a small but fast army. He was enraged. It says here he was enraged, we read earlier. Why was he enraged at the Persians? Because they had defeated Greek armies at two big battles in history. The Battle of Marathon, some of you at least maybe have heard of that, 490 BC, and the Battle of Salamis, 481 BC. In both of those battles, the Medo-Persians defeated the Greeks on their soil. And that was one of the reasons Alexander the Great was so enraged against them and attacked them, and of course ended up defeating them. The Persians were helpless. The Medes and the Persians were helpless to resist. He died actually, I didn't mention the first time I mentioned his death. I mentioned alcoholism, but he also had some malaria from some historical accounts as well. And he died at the age of 32 or 33 in Babylon. And so, as verse 8 predicted, at the height of his power, he was what? You remember the phrase? Cut off. That's right. He was cut off, as verse 8 predicted, that this horn would be cut off. So after 20 years of fighting among Alexander's generals and the Greek politicians, again, you get to this division that I've already talked about here on the map. There was a lot of infighting and so forth that led to this division of the kingdom. But the divided kingdoms never had the power that Alexander the Great had. But it's not so much, there's arguments about who the original four kings were of the four kingdoms, but that's really not nearly as important as to identify the horn which started small but grew out of one of those four horns. And again, that powerful ruler is what we're going to look at here now, verses 23 through 25. 23 through 25. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master in intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. And when they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Now again, got to really be careful here. Have to really be careful. Years later, and remember, Daniel's writing back before Belshazzar was even killed. Daniel was writing this, received these visions before the Babylonian Empire was even conquered by the Medo-Persians yet. And now he's giving more information about after the Greek kingdom conquered the Medo-Persian kingdom. So this is, again, nearly 400 years in the future when Daniel was writing about this. He said a powerful ruler would rise up from among one of the four horns. From one of the four kingdoms of the divided people, the holy people, the nation Israel, would be a special target of his oppression. His antagonism against Israel would also be against Israel's God, the only true God, the God of the Bible, the Prince of princes, as it's described here in these verses we just read. But this mighty ruler himself would be destroyed by supernatural power. His rise would not be of his own doing, and his downfall would not be by human means either, because, again, who raises up kings and who tears them down? God. That's the theme all through Daniel here. God raises up kings and God tears them down, and he uses them to accomplish his purposes. It's not of their doing. This king would turn out to be who? Who would this Greek king turn out to be? Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes. After murdering his own brother, Antiochus murdered his own brother, who had initially inherited the throne in the Seleucid dynasty. Antiochus came to power around 175 BC. Around 171 or 170 BC, he invaded and then defeated Egypt to his south and announced himself king in Egypt. That was the predicted growth in verse 9 about how he would grow to the south. He went down and conquered Egypt. World history will tell you that. On his return from that conquest, trouble broke out in Jerusalem. He had decided to subdue them. And of course, Jerusalem and that area was referred to earlier as what? The beautiful land. That also was predicted, that this one would do that. Again, we're filling in the blanks here of what ended up happening for what Daniel was prophesying was going to happen. And almost 400 years later is when it happened. The Jewish people were forced to submit to him and his authority. The temple was desecrated. The temple treasury was plundered. All this happened around 170 BC. Antiochus then went back to Egypt, but he eventually got forced out of Egypt by the Romans. And he went back to Jerusalem, and now he's mad, and he decided to take out his fury on Jerusalem, and he burned the city. He killed a whole bunch more Jews. The Jews were forbidden to follow the Mosaic law in a whole bunch of ways. They weren't allowed to observe the Sabbath, no feast, traditional sacrifices. They weren't allowed to circumcise the male kids. Idols to pagan altars were set up in Jerusalem. And on December 16th, 167 BC, the Jews were ordered to offer unclean sacrifices and to eat pig meat. And the penalty for disobedience was death. As we read in verses 13 and 14, the angel said that the devastation and the trampling of Jerusalem was to last how long? 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, again, I'll tell you, there's some different opinions about what that stands for. I am in the camp of what seems to be the most literal way of taking it, and that's what many solid theologians believe, that 2,300 evenings and mornings would be 2,300 days. A day has an evening and has a morning, and so it would be 2,300 days. That seems to be the most literal way to understand it. 2,300 days would be 6 years and about 4.5 months. And that matches up very well with the timeline that would start when Antiochus Epiphanes first invaded Jerusalem in 170 BC. And then we know that around late 164 BC, a Jewish man led a rebellion and ended up restoring the temple. And what was that Jewish man's name? Judas Maccabeus. Judas Maccabeus eventually led that rebellion, and that's the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees tell about a lot of that stuff that happened as a part of apocryphal writings. So some historical accounts say that Antiochus Epiphanes died insane in Babylon. Once again, the non-biblical book of 1st Maccabees may shed some light on the end of his life. It says that after he received word of what seemed to be, it couldn't be anything much more than a miraculous victory by the Jews over the military of the Seleucid Empire there. After he had found out about that, he got really sick. And supposedly he said he knew he was dying, and he remembered the evil things he had done while he was in Jerusalem. And he perceived that they were the reason that he was dying. In any case, again, his destruction was not of human power. In the same way that he initially became who initially received his power, was not just of him. God, again, was continuing to use pagan kings and kingdoms to accomplish God's purposes. They would come to power as God determined, and they would fall from power as God determined, all in accordance with the will of God. And again, that is just a major theme you need to be understanding. And all this stuff through Daniel about these Gentile kingdoms and so forth, that's a big part of understanding the whys behind all these rises and falls of these kingdoms and why God allowed some of the horrible things that they did and so forth. It was all part of the bigger plan, and a big part of that plan was the punishment of the nation Israel. And there's still more punishment coming because they continue to rebel. I say once more that there is generally no question among theologians that Antiochus is in view in this prophecy here in chapter 8 in Daniel. What was prophesied was fulfilled literally through him. However, the prophecy looks beyond Antiochus to a future person as well. And that's who? The Antichrist. And so Antiochus was just a foreshadowing or a type of the future Antichrist who will come. Thus, the prophecy has to go beyond Antiochus and look forward to the coming of somebody whose career, again, will parallel that of Antiochus, but it'll have a far greater significance. I've previously referred to this kind of stuff as layered prophecy. Layered prophecy. Again, Daniel predicted the rise of this ruler who turned out to be Antiochus Epiphanes almost 400 years before it happened. But also contained in Daniel's words here, revealed to him by God, was the prediction of someone who would be like Antiochus, except far worse, who would come later on. And as we continue through the book of Daniel, we will see more how that's going to wash out someday, and how that's all going to pan out for Israel someday. Verses 26 to 27 to close. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was worn out, and I lay exhausted for several days, and then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. Gabriel told Daniel to seal up the vision. That meant he was to protect it. He was to safeguard it. He was to keep it. He eventually got it written down. Wrote the details down to preserve them. And again, folks, because this prediction ended up being so accurate to what has happened, what will be taught continues to be taught in world history classes all over the world, this stuff actually ended up being, because of the fact of how closely it was predicted by the prophet Daniel. Because of that, critics of the Bible still today say that there's no way that he wrote this stuff before it happened. That they say that the account of the book of Daniel wasn't written back in the 6th century, but it had to be written like up in the 1st century after the stuff had already happened. Because there's no way somebody could predict all that stuff that closely. Just like the division of the 4 kingdoms. Nobody could do that. But what's that discounting? God, the miraculous. And you know what's even more sad? Many churches dispute that very thing as well. Many churches deny that Daniel actually could have predicted all that stuff that accurately. Many churches hold a view that the book of Daniel wasn't written until much, much later, after all this stuff happened. Isn't that sad? Notice also Daniel continued to be confused with these visions that God was giving him. And like I said last week, can we blame him? We have world history. We have everything that's happened in world history to help us understand what was being predicted. We have the whole New Testament, which adds new revelation, and it's still not real easy to understand, is it? I've worked real hard to try to explain it, but I know it's a lot. But just think about if you're Daniel, how hard it had to have been for him. to try to work his way through that, because he had none of this additional revelation, and he certainly didn't know that we already know that a lot of the story has already happened. Everything through Antiochus Epiphanes has already happened. The only thing that hasn't is that future person who will be like Antiochus, who is yet to come. But everything else has already happened. And we still, it's kind of like, oh boy, this is a lot. Remember, verse 1 said Daniel had this vision when? The 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, the king of Babylon, the last king of Babylon. And so with Babylon still very much in business, Daniel could hardly imagine how Media and Persia would conquer anybody, would conquer Babylon, let alone, Daniel couldn't imagine anyway that a kingdom from the area of Greece, who at that point, again, only existed as some city-states and a very small kingdom of Macedon, there was no way that he could even imagine how could that little thing grow into something big enough to conquer, be a world power or whatever. There was just no way he could put those pieces together in his mind. And then furthermore, when it talked about the temple being restored, again, remember, when Daniel was getting these visions, this is just prior to the end of the Babylonian kingdom, what condition is the temple in? Yes! It's in ruins! And not only the temple, but
All of this.
the whole city of Jerusalem was still destroyed. And so Daniel, this stuff's being revealed to Daniel about, the temple being rebuilt and reconsecrated and all that kind of stuff. And he's like, but there is no temple. There's not even a city when Daniel was getting this revelation. And so he's just whacked out. He's just saying, I can't understand. This stuff's beyond understanding, right? And again, if you understand all this, you can get why he would be so whacked out about it. The small horn that grew actually came and fulfilled all that was predicted of him. That small horn who grew being, again, who? Which man? Antiochus Epiphanes. The little horn, the final and the worst evil world ruler, who will be similar to what Antiochus was, only much worse, he also will eventually come. And all that was written about him will be fulfilled. All the horrible things written about that ruler will come to be. Eventually they will be fulfilled. But we got a better end of the story, right? Because there's another one that's going to come. The rider on the white horse in Revelation 19, the Lord Jesus Christ. And who will be riding with him? All of us who place saving faith in him. But we ain't going to have to do any fighting, because he's going to do all the fighting with the sword out of his mouth, the word of God, and he will say the command, and the enemies will all be destroyed. Jesus wins. Hallelujah.
Amen.
What a Savior. That's the closing hymn. Hallelujah. What a Savior. 311. Stand and sing it with me, please. 311.